It is the curse of all royalty to be compared with their forebears. My illustrious father built himself a kingdom in his youth. Now I can barely hold on to it in mine. I hear all of the nobility's whisperings at court. They say that I may be King of England by birth, but I will never be so by merit. That I, Edward II, am unworthy of my father's name. How much longer until these whispers become cries of rebellion? My heart quivers when I visit his tomb in the Abbey. I am racked by fear. It claws at my soul like the talons of demons. Fear that I will prove them right. That I will disgrace this family's legacy, as my grandfather did. Yet I must not give in. I will study my father's reign, and hope that it will imbue me with his strength, the fortitude that I so lack. My father, Edward, spent his youth watching in disgust as his ineffectual father, Henry, drove England to the brink of ruin. When his subjects could bear his ruinous reign no more, a rebellion led by the Baron Simon de Montfort deposed Henry, leaving his kingdom in tatters. After the disastrous Battle of Lewes, the baronial forces captured and jailed my father and grandfather in Hereford. Some kings begin their rise to the throne from within the palace. Edward began his from the anguish of imprisonment. Yet even when the future seems bleak, fate occasionally extends its hand and offers allies from the most unlikely of places. Like his Norman ancestors, Gilbert de Clare was a shrewd opportunist. Initially a commander in the rebel army, he keenly sensed its divisions and saw that he could further his own ambitions by defecting to Edward. My father moved with alarming speed. Worcester and Gloucester, Gilbert's family seat, were seized without delay. After a string of further victories, he compelled the leaderless and battered rebel forces to capitulate. Known by many as Longshanks, Edward was feared for his imposing stature and foul temper. While Henry was restored to the throne, all were well aware that Edward was now the true power behind it. Ruthless and cunning, Edward did not always adhere to the chivalric codes that the European nobility held so dear. After massacring Simon the Younger's men in a stealthy night attack on Kenilworth, he used the captured banners to disguise his army before smashing de Montfort at Evesham. In an act of alarming brutality, the corpse of de Montfort, an Earl of England, was hacked into carrion and his head mounted on a pike. Edward had won the war and cowed the rebels into submission in just over a year, but the victory came at the cost of his honor. Nobility and clergy alike cringed at the thought of an impious butcher one day ascending to the throne of England. To restore his ailing reputation and prove himself worthy of the crown, my father resolved to lead a crusade east to the Holy Land, where the situation grew increasingly dire. The voracious Mamluk Sultanate waged a fierce war of expansion, first against the Mongols and now against the beleaguered Crusaders. Several fortresses quickly fell before their unstoppable onslaught. Their leader was Sultan Baibars, a man not unlike my father Edward. Originally a slave of Cuman origin, he rose to prominence through military service and had recently taken power after murdering the reigning sultan. Having just slaughtered the population of Antioch, his armies now threatened Oka and Tripoli from the east, converging on both cities in a suffocating siege. Edward's army arrived in Oka to find the inhabitants desperate, but not beyond hope. The fighting was vicious. Droves of Crusaders and Mamluks alike fell, spattering the battlements and the fields surrounding Acre and Tripoli with blood and gore. Throughout the crusade, my father proved his mettle as a tactician and as a statesman. Fearless when faced with peril, he led a daring raid that devastated the enemy towns of Nazareth and Cocoon. Following these victories, he convinced the terrifying horde of the Mongol Ilkhanate to descend upon the Mamluks, devastating the region around Aleppo. The hitherto invincible Baibars was overwhelmed and forced to withdraw. But before doing so, he sent a Nizari with a poisoned blade to remove his capable rival. Edward slew the assassin, but a wound in his arm left him bedridden for months. Edward left the Holy Land in an uneasy truce. Baibars had promised to keep the peace for 10 years, 10 months, and 10 days. Now, with more pressing matters developing back in England, my father could only hope that the Sultan would keep his word. While Edward was away on crusade, building his reputation as an honorable and capable leader, his father Henry died, leaving him the English crown. He returned to an England both stable and eagerly anticipating his arrival. On August the 19th, 1274, the Lord Edward was crowned Edward I of England. Wishing to expand his new kingdom, Edward set his sights west towards Wales, an old enemy that had supported Simon de Montfort during the Baronial Rebellion. The Welsh prince Llewellyn ap Griffith constantly antagonized the Anglo-Norman marcher lords on the border. Adding insult to injury, he took Simon de Montfort's daughter, Eleanor, as his bride. My father pounced on the already fractured Welsh factions, seeking to conquer them piece by piece. But if there was one thing that the Welsh princes hated more than each other, it was Englishmen imposing their laws on Welsh territory. Llewellyn's brother, Dafydd, joined the fray, and the brothers waged a war of stealth and ambushes, defeating Edward's southern armies under Luc de Tanny and Gilbert de Clare. Seeing that the hardy folk of these mountainous forests and coarse heaths would not bend easily to his will, my father changed tactics. If the Welsh could not be crushed in open battle, they would be brought to heel from a series of impenetrable castles. The Welsh fought valiantly, but they were no match for Edward's wrath. My father's forces outmaneuvered Llewellyn's forces and smashed them at Orwen Bridge. The Welsh prince fell to the lance of a lone rider who knew not the importance of the man whom he had slain. His brother Dafydd was captured at Nanny's Glen and declared a traitor to the English crown. Edward pitilessly condemned his bold adversary to be drawn and quartered. Wales was now firmly in my father's grip. He bestowed upon me the title of Prince of Wales, which shall be an heirloom of my line henceforth. The network of formidable fortifications that Edward constructed throughout the land shall ensure that the Welsh bow to the English crown for generations to come. I fear that I am deceiving myself in studying only my father's achievements in war. As king, I must be both a warrior and a statesman, just as he was. Drawing inspiration from the legendary stories of King Arthur, Edward grew from a deceitful and duplicitous youth into a pious and chivalrous ruler respected throughout Christendom. My father implemented economic, administrative, and legal reforms that strengthened and stabilized his kingdom. His borrowing of Byzantine concepts led him to be known as the English Justinian. Yet to Edward, this was just another part of ruling effectively, and everything that he did furthered his fierce desire to rule over all of Britain. When Alexander III of Scotland died without a male heir, that ambition suddenly seemed within reach. My father first strove to marry Alexander's young granddaughter, Margaret, to me, the heir apparent to England. When she died, unexpectedly, just a year later, Edward instead installed John Balliol as king in Scotland. The proud Scots would not suffer themselves to be ruled by an English puppet, whose master sought to conscript them into war with France. Instead, they allied themselves with the French and rose in open rebellion. Edward's fury was unbridled. If Balliol could not hold his subjects in line, my father would seize Scotland by force. Father was unspeakably cruel to the Scots. In retribution for an attack on Carlisle, he seized and sacked the wealthy town of Berwick, slaughtering some 20,000 inhabitants. Balliol, the puppet that Edward had installed as king in Scotland, proved himself a traitor. He marched the Scottish army south against the English, but it was viciously drubbed at the Battle of Dunbar. Begging for mercy, Balliol capitulated to Edward, who scornfully stripped him of his coat of arms. This disgrace earned him the moniker Tomb Tabard, empty coat. As a final humiliation, Edward seized the coronation stone from the monastery in Scone and placed it in a chair in Westminster Abbey. That hallowed stone of Scone, a symbol of Scottish royalty, shall now sanctify the destiny of an undying line of English kings. Scots did not take their humbling well. A year after Balliol's defeat, they rallied around the fiery knight, William Wallace, and poured out of the Highlands like rabid wolves. Wallace was said to be a 7-foot-tall giant, who lopped off the heads of horses and men with a 5.5-foot sword. A barbaric match for my own ferocious father. After a string of unexpected victories, Wallace's rebels were scattered at the Battle of Falkirk and forced into hiding. Like a vengeful spectre, he continued to harry English troops and convoys from the shadows. Undaunted, Edward and his commander, Aymer de Valence, approached Stirling Castle. Accompanying them was Robert the Bruce, a Scottish lord sworn to Edward, but known to covet the Scottish crown. Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer, as the ancient adage goes. Taking after his famed predecessor, Richard the Lionheart, he ordered the construction of a massive set of trebuchets near the walls of Stirling. His warning to the defenders was simple and dreadful. Surrender, or face bombardment more ferocious than a rain of hellfire and brimstone. William Wallace's body was butchered, and his remains were scattered across Scotland as a grim warning to any who might fancy themselves a heroic rebel. Yet the effect was the opposite of what my father hoped for. The dying embers of rebellion were kindled into a raging flame as the treacherous Robert the Bruce renounced his vassalage and raised his banners. With his last war still raging, my father, the mighty King of England and Hammer of the Scots, passed away. England is now mine to rule. His vision mine to fulfill. Or to squander. Robert the Bruce remains a threat, and unrest brews throughout England. Even my own barons openly show their contempt and demand that my powers be diminished. I have studied all that my father did, and still the task at hand terrifies me. He faced every adversity and grew to be a great king. Yet I already feel my soul buckling under the weight of the crown. I am king now. But what king shall I be? Should I be deceptive, as my father was in his youth? Should I be the pious and chivalrous administrator? Or brutal to no end, the new Hammer of the Scots? However can a man become so great as to fulfill all of these roles? I fear that there is no answer. Even so, When I stand by my father's tomb, the fear and the shame sometimes sweep aside. Deep within me, I know that whatever else I must try, I must fight for my crown, my kingdom, and for my father's legacy.